Yeah, okay. So I think we can begin if you are okay, Eve.
I'm okay.
Okay. So I'm happy to have Evelina with us eventually because there were so many obstacles previously that and it was unfortunate that we couldn't have Evelina with us. She is, as you all know, a postdoc researcher in our ERC project, and she has been working for many years now on metaphysics, and notably she has done the critical edition of a commentary on the metaphysics belonging to uh, Henry of Ghent, most probably. I think something like 600 pages, the critical edition. Hopefully it will be published soon. And she has been working also on Albert the Great, mainly in the past 3-4 years, probably, on fluxus and being and essence and so on. And we hope to organize together next year the conference on the fourth book of the fourth proposition of the Book of Causes. It was meant to be this year, but as you know, due to the current global problems, we had to postpone the conference. And I will immediately leave Evelina to begin her talk on the origin of creation in Albert the Great, Universale, latissimae, universalitatis, a very intriguing title indeed. So thank you, Eve, whenever
Also,
you want.
thank you, everybody. So it's difficult to say whether it was more the Liber de Causis that shaped Albert's philosophical and theological reflection, or Albert's reading of the Liber de Causis that had a profound effect on the posterity of the Liber de Causis, as Dragos can say much better than I. One of the best known aspects of Albert's thought is undoubtedly his metaphysics of flow, and his attempt to harmonize the creatio ex nihilo with the Neoplatonic model of procession and emanation. Albert was, in fact, the main systematizer of the notion of fluxus in the Latin world, and the text in which he did so is his commentary paraphrase to the Liber de Causis. Today, I would like to try to analyze together, first, the definition that Albert gives of fluxus, the way he describes the creative process of the first cause, second, third, the various way in which he defines the first and the only product of the first cause. My hypothesis, just an hypothesis, but is that the nature of the flow considered in its very original moment, as soon as it flows, so to speak, from the first cause, can only be understood in the light of how Albert understands the first product of the first cause, and vice versa. I will try to get some texts with a minimum of introductory commentary on my part, and to read them together. And I'm extremely interested in your contribution and what you think about that. As we all know, Albert wrote his De Causis et Processo Universitatis a prima causa between 1276-77 and 1278, sorry, while he was completing his Metaphysics. Like most of his contemporaries, Albert considered the Liber de Causis not only the crowing and completion of Aristotle's Metaphysics, but also a work at least in part authentically Aristotelian. In fact, Albert, and his position is original on this point, he thinks that okay, I'll say it better later. The De Causis et Processo Universitatis has a bipartite structure. The first book, as we can see here, the structure of the first book, in the first slide, on the one hand, describes the properties of the first cause and what proceeds from it, and performs a double function with respect to the second book. It has both an introductory and an explanatory value, in the sense that it offers the criteria for understanding what comes in the second book. In fact, Albert very often uses expression in the second book, such as sicut patet ex ante habitis, and he's referring to the first book, thus showing, in my opinion, the strong link between the two books of his De Causis. The first book, as we can see here, is divided in 4 treatises. And the actual commentary on the Liber de Causis, even though we all know that it's much more an original paraphrase than a literal comment, begins only with the second book, which deals with the determination of the first causes, and it's divided into 5 treatises. The 4th treatise of the first book, which is also the hinge point between the 2 books, is dedicated to the flow and the order of causes. We can go to the next slide, thank you. Albert's metaphysics of flow is based, first of all, on the distinction between the causal modis expressed by these 3 verbs: causare, fluere, principiare. We can read together. I see all of you. Unde, we are reading from the first chapter of the 4th treatise. Unde cum causa nihil agat nisi in subiecto aliquo existens, fluxus autem de ratione sua nihil dicat nisi processum forme ab ipso simplici formali principio, patet quod fluere non est idem quod causare. A cause always acts in a pre-existing subject. And for this reason, we cannot properly say that the first cause, we cannot properly also call the first cause, even though Albert does so in the, throughout his all the causes. Second, aduc autem nec idem est quod principiare fluere, always. Si enim vis fiat in eo quod est principium, omne principium aliquid rei est, cuius est principium. Et hoc sonat ipsum nomen, principium enim primum rei est. Id autem quod fons talis fluxus est, de quo hic loquimur, non semper aliquid rei est, quia primus fons nulli commiscibili est, nec pars potest esse alicuius rei quam constituit. A principle is always something of that originates from it, and for this reason, it is always somehow mixed with what he produces. For this reason, we cannot say that the first cause, we cannot properly say that first cause is a principle. I would like just to stress one thing now that maybe will become clearer later. He says that principiare is not the correct verb for the to describe the action of the origin of the fluxus of God, the first cause, but because the first cause is never is nulli commiscibilis, cannot be never mixed, but it seems to open an exception because he says not semper aliquid rei est. It does not say that never. It is not, but it gives the possibility of an exception. We will say, in my opinion, which is this exception. We can go to the next slide. And here stress again a very important concept. Et causa quidem prima est, in qua sicut in fonte effectivo et formali et finali sunt omnia. Propter quod essentialiter et presentia luminis sui et potentia virtutis sue necesse est eam esse extensam per omnia preter hoc quod nulli est, and sorry, there's a mistake, immixta, sicut essentialis spars essentia ipsius. So what he wanted to avoid is that the first cause is somehow a part of or a constituent of the essence of the created things. We can go to the next slide. And then in his according to Albert's most famous definition, The flow is nothing or other than the emanation of a form from the first source of the fluxus, which is also the source and the origin of all forms. I've stressed the singular and plural for a reason. I will read it in Latin. Exis patet, quod fluxus est simpliciter emanatio forme, a primo fonte. So fluxus is only, strictly speaking, or at the beginning, the emanatio forme, a primo fonte, from the source of the flow. And the source of the flow, it's also the origin of all other forms. Next one. So to better explain his intention, Albert uses the example of the form of the art. The form of art, in fact, which flows from the pure and simple art, remains the same in the spirit. I will read the passage in Latin soon. Albert does not specify whose spirit is this, even if it clearly seems to me to refer to the spirit of art itself, rather than to the spirit of the craftsman, which is its vehicle when it flows into the hands and organon of the craftsman, and when it is considered in art itself as in its origin. If a mutation occurs in matter into which the form of art flows, this mutation is not attributable to the essence of the principle from which the flow originates, but to some other causes that perform an instrumental function, but they have nothing to do with the first cause. This concept of vehiculum is extremely important, in my opinion. Sicut dicimus, forma, Latin is always better than best translation. My translation is not a good one, but to read in Latin, in my opinion, is always most clear. Sicut dicimus, forma artis ab arte simplici fluere, quae iusdem rationis est in spiritu, qui vehiculum sum est, quando fluit in manus et organa artificis, e quando accipitur in ipsa arte ut in origine sua. Si enim aliquid transmutat materiam, in quam influit forma defluens, octamel nihil est de essentia principi, a quo fit de fluxus, sed sunt qualitates active vel passive, alicuius alterius cause instrumentaliter transmutantis subjectum. Sicut et securs instrumenta sunt artificis adibita corporaliter propter materiam, non propter formam artis, quae defluit, vel propter artem, quae principium est fluxus illius. So the form, it's always the same throughout all the process. We can go to the next one. But it also, we don't have the quotation in my PowerPoint, but to explain the particular causality of the fluxus, which is a kind of univocal causality, Albert also uses, compares the fluxus to a stream gushing from its source. We all know this image, but I would just like to repeat it. As the water flowing in the stream has the same form as the water present in the source and which flows from it, so in the same ways, it does not, in the same way, there's not a difference of form, properly speaking, from the origin of fluxus and the fluxus. Should have a formal identity, even though this is a bigger problem than to explain why the first cause or the fluxus is not really identical with God. But he chooses this, in my opinion, Albert in this chapter says clearly that he prefers the fluxum also because it offers a kind of univocal causality. Also, Delibera wrote a lot about Albert's idea of univocal causality to explain how this kind of causality can be acceptable from a theological, Christian theological point of view. Now, in this, okay, the vehiculum now. Albert, we have seen in the slide before that Albert himself had spoken of vehiculum in the case of the spirit of art itself, which transports the form from the art to the ends and organs of the craftsman and then in the final product. One could therefore think of the flow as a vehicle of the emanation and at the form as the product of emanation. So we have two things. The fluxus, we may think, fluxus, it's like a vehicle, and the form, it's the product. This, however, would compromise the simplicity that Albert himself claims for the first emanation. Aware of the possible ambiguity of the image of the vehicle, Albert himself takes care to specify in what sense it should be understood when referring to the first emanation. In fact, and only in this specific case, if we were to ask ourselves which is the vehicle of what flows, the question will be completely meaningless. The emanation from the first intellectual source is as simple according to its essence as it is according to its being. And the vehicle is nothing other than its own self-communicability. It's a very strong affirmation. And as far as I've had the possibility to read many times all the Albert's houses, this definition is appropriated only for the very beginning of the fluxus. Only at the very beginning, in the fluxus, the process, the form are perfectly identical and simple. It's the form that has this kind of self-communicability, does not need something else to communicate itself to others. This form, which coincides with the first emanation, does not need something to transport it to the following degrees of being, also because, as we shall see, it is itself the principle of what follows. So, its dynamism is entirely due to its own nature, and self-communicability, it's proper to its own nature. As Thérèse Bonin has rightly observed in her book, Creation as Emanation, where she said that in a sort of sense, Albert gives to the first created characteristic, the self-communicability, that is usually attributed mostly to the first cause. There is a very important reason, because it's a very original, in my opinion, interpretation of the idea of the creatio mediante intelligentia, because it's not the first intelligence, but it's the being, and we have to understand what does it mean with this being. We can go to the next slide. Now, the flow considered in its first origin, when it flows from its source, is always described as emanation or procession of a single and unique form. It is a simplex form, just as simple is the origin of the flow and the flow itself, which consists simpliciter in the emanation of that form. Moreover, although the direct product of the first cause is only one, the flow is in the singular always an emanatio forme, or he will say later a lumen, a singular. The first, it's whether he called it forma or lumen or sometimes intelligentia or res, it's always singular. This does not mean that the first cause loses its causal and providential, from a Christian point of view, nexus with respect to everything else. The first source remains, however, albeit indirectly, fons et origo omnium formarum. I will reread these three main definitions of fluxus. Non fluit nisi id quod unius forma est influente, et in eo a quo fit fluxus. A fonte autem a quo fit fluxus, non fluit nisi forma simplex. One simplex absqueo quod aliquid transmutet in subjecto per motum. Fluxus autem de ratione sua nil dicat nisi processum forme. Ab ipso simplici formali principio, or exis patet quod fluxus est simpliciter emanatio forme a prima fonte, qui omnium formarum est fonte origo. So, the second aspect common to each of this description of the first flow is the insistence on the adjective simplex, or equally the adverb simpliciter. As the first cause is simplex, simplex is also the act of emanation and the very form in which this act consists. That the primary cause is simplex, it's obvious. Just to use Boetius' famous formulation in De Hebdomadibus, taken up several times and commented upon by Albert also in his De Causis, in God there is no distinction between quod est, quo est, and id quod est. Much less obvious, nevertheless, is instead that also and only that the form that emanates directly from the first cause is simplex, according to her being and her essence. Although Albert, in distinguishing fluere from causare, has already insisted that the causality of the flow is an univocal one, and that the form of the water is always the same, whether it is considered in the source of the stream or in what flows. There is therefore a sort of univocity between the first cause and its first emanation, which makes the latter also as simple almost. There's a huge difference, but only one, that it's created as its origin. Even the flow is characterized in the form of an adverb by simplicity in this case, because later on, then Albert uses the expression vehiculum corporale, something that transports the forms, but it's the origin of the fluxus that transport the forms. This is my interpretation. Even the flow is characterized in the form of an adverb by simplicity. It is nothing more than a simpliciter, the emanation of form from the first source of all things. The insistence on the simplicity of the flow, considered in its origin as a very precise reason, which seems to me to be that of avoiding any possible hint of dualism in this first moment of creation. In the example already considered of the form of art, as I said, Albert himself had spoken of a vehiculum which transports the form. But in this case, there's no dualism. We can go to the next slides. Thank you. And here, there's, in my opinion, a very strong, even though not so explicit, statement of Albert that goes to the simplicity of the first created, but it's really strong. Inter omnia autem que principiorum habent nomen et rationem, and the first created being, or the first cause, or the first emanation, can properly be said principium, because he takes being to all the degrees of what exists. Okay. Precipue sic fluit intellectus agens, qui lumine, I translated through his lumen, quod sibi essentia est, de se sic semper formas emanat. So everybody knows that Albert calls also God intellectus agens. It's a way he calls God. But through his light, and his light, it's for him like his own essence, he emanat continuously. It's an eternal creation and also necessary creation, if you want to say, but free, nevertheless free for Albert. He always emanates forms. It's a very strong, I found it very strong to say that the lumen, his lumen, that is the way through which the first cause emanates all the forms, is its essence, somehow its essence. In the next slide, we can go to the next, okay. It's again, and I repeated the passage we already quoted before, we already read before, because this may also explain why he can say also for the first created, that is simplex tam secundum essentiam quam secundum esse. And behind, I would just like to add a little things, and if you want, we can go in more in details at the end. That behind the insistence on the simplicity of form and flow, there is certainly also the problem elaborated by the Arabic peripatetic tradition, and effectively condensed in the Latin formula ab uno non est nisciunum. And unlike his contemporaries, maybe we have a quotation from Thomas later, it's not important, Albert was the only one, as far as I know, to identify in the Liber de Causis not only one of the sources of this doctrine, but the original source. Maybe it's the next slide. Okay. Adu cautem fortissime ubicitur quod ab uno simplici non est nisciunum, eccenim propositio ab Aristotele scribitur in epistola quest de principio universi esse, et ab Alfarabia, Vicenna, Verro, et suscipitur et explanatur. I think that this observation, we do not know exactly the nature of this epistola he's referring to. If is there an extent, if he read directly something with such a title, or if it's just knew of the existence of this text indirectly, and it's most probably so. But in my opinion, it's interesting that he decided that a text he never read directly, most probably, was the very origin of this theory, is because he found, Albert, in the Liber de Causis, according to, obviously, to his own interpretation, an idea of this unum that proceeds from the first cause that he could not find in any other text coming from the Arabic sources, because it was not, as he reads the fourth proposition, an intelligence, the first intelligence, substance, but something else. So, and he finds in his interpretation of the fourth proposition a way to harmonize, I think, also this idea of fluxus, of emanation, with his own also doctrine of universal, and with somehow a Christian view on creation, the Christian doctrine of creation. And this is the reason why, in my opinion, he attributed directly to this epistola and to the Liber de Causis, to Aristotle, obviously, the origin of this doctrine. It's interesting. We can go maybe to the next. For example, Thomas, just to quote an example, he says that we can find this doctrine or this principle also in Liber de Causis, but it's not the Liber de Causis the source. As far as I know, it's something original of Albert. We can go to the next. Okay. 4, 5, lumen intellettuale. I think, which, could you tell me please the number of the slide? I've lost it in. Oh, 13, 14. Okay, in the course of all the causes et processo universitatis a prima causa, we meet several definition of the first created things that, at least at the first sight, are not easily reconcilable with one another. I've listed all of them, and they're more or less the one I present to you today. The first product of the same cause is at the same time lumen intellectuale. He says lumen quod intelligentia est, primum quidem lumen intellectuale intellectus agentis. I quoted two passages where he is more clear. Propter quod etiam omne quod emanat ab ipso protest simplex et purus intellectus sive immediate emanet sive per medium procul dubio intellectuale lumen est. Ab ipso enim immediate emanat lumen quod intelligentia est. And in another passage also we read, fluit ergo quod secundum se ipsum se extendit in sui multiplicationem, quem admodum Plato dixit deformis per se existentibus. Hoc autem non est nisi primum quidem lumen intellectuale intellectus agentis. Intellectus agentis of God, in this case. We can go to the next slide. So it's a lumen, intellectual lumen. It's a form, as we have seen, a forma simplex that flows, or the flux of a form. And about the form, I've chosen this passage. Quamvis enim natura secundum hoc nomen ad aliud sit, tamen natura est forma absoluta. Et nisi forma esset, natura esse non posset, quia rationem nature non haberet. So form is used like a synonym I will explain later, but form as a nature, as a kind of, to stress is its essential nature. We can go to the next. It's being. I will say more about being, commenting his Albert exegesis of the first proposition. It's being. In the first book, Albert just said that being is the foundation of all that exists. And this, he said, aduc primum causatum est esse unius cuiusque. Esse enim fundamentum est omnium aliorum. Causatum autem primum cause prime est proprium. Causa ergo prima diffusiva est esse in existentibus omnibus. So it's lumen intellectuale, or an intelligence. It's a form, it's the fluxus of a form, it's being, and it's also simplex conceptus, as he says in commenting the fourth proposition of the Liber de Causis, or an intelligence. I have to say that as far as I had the possibility to read, Albert avoided to speak, to use the term intelligentsia to describe the first product of the first cause, because to avoid, and he said somewhere explicitly that intelligentsia is a word that is very equivocal. It may may raise many problems, and here is never speaking about this intelligence as a substance. Then we can go next. Okay. So what interests me for now is to have a synthetic but synoptic look at all the ways Albert calls the first cause. How can, my question was when I began my research, how can the same thing be at the same time an intellectual ray, a flow that is the emanation of a form, a simple form, being somehow shared by all creatures, and being a simple conceptus. Having such different definitions seems to me to depend on two things, factors. The first is linked to the very particular and unique nature of the first created. The second is determined by the different perspectives that Albert uses from time to time, but the overall impression, however, is that the nature of the first product of the first cause is properly grasped only starting from a synoptic analysis of all these definitions in a circular way, so to say, trying to identify the specific function of each of them. So I'll try to do it in an extremely synthetic way. Form. It says something about its essential nature. It's not a substance. Oh, sorry, it remained in Italian. Okay, it's not a substance, even though in Albert lexicon, forma is the proper meaning of substance. Its forma or fluxus offers the idea of formal identity between the origin of the flow and the flow itself. It also gives the idea of a dynamic and eternal creation, because from the source it always flows something. And intellectual lumen. He wants to give the idea of intellectual causality, or the causality of an intellectual nature. So he's specifying what kind of nature do we have to mean when we understand it as a forma. And it suggests the idea of something simple, just like a ray, that can produce diversity. Albert uses, he says that a single ray of light can be refracted, giving rise to multiplicity. So the first product of the emanation, even though it's simple and we will say it's unus, can give, it's the origin of multiplicity or diversity. We can go to the next when you want. Okay, Albert deals extensively with being then as the first created in the first treatise of the second book. It's also important because it's not the second treatise is dedicated to intelligences. The first one to the primary causes. So dedicated to the property of primary causes, and obviously in his commentary on the fourth proposition of the Liber de Causis. This is, as is well known, one of the most quoted and commented upon proposition of all the Liber de Causis, and also one of those that has raised the greatest problems of interpretation, as Pasquale Porro has already shown. The main problem with which the first, but not only, Latin interpreters had to deal was how to reconcile two apparently contradictory statements present in the text of the fourth proposition. That is, the main question concerns the identification of the being that is the first created. Because the first created must indeed be the first creating being, the direct and most authentic product of the first cause, the most extensive reality, the only product of the first cause, because Albert always read the fourth proposition together with the 17th. And we in the 17th proposition, we read that only ens or essentia is created. All the rest is per informazione. So kind of formal determination, but it depends on how to interpret per informazione. But there is only one created thing, only one direct product of the first cause, and it's being. Yet at the same time, as we read in the secondary proposition, I just made a choice of some of them, we will read them together. It is an intelligence. Let's read together now the main characteristic that the first created has according to the author of the Liber de Causis. In my opinion, among his contemporaries, Albert manages to give the most acute and coherent interpretation of the whole text of the fourth proposition. And however, as far as our discourse is concerned, it seems interesting to me to underline that the essential characteristic and the corresponding function of the first created, as we can read them in the fourth proposition of the De Causis, are the same, or more or less, of those seen before in Albert's account of the origin of creation, the first form, the fluxus, in the first book. Okay, we read them together. The lemma is extremely famous. Prima rerum creatarum est esse, et non est ante ipsum creatum aliud. And then, according to the secondary proposition, this being must be supra sensum, supra animam, supra intelligentiam. Latius, non est post causam primam latius, neque prius creatum ipso. Then propter illud ergo factum est superius creatis rebus omnibus et vehementius unitum. It also has, it's not superior to everything else, but it also has extremely tight link with everything else. Ipsum quidem non est factum multa, nisi quia ipsum quamvis sit simplex et non sit in creatis, sorry, simplicius eo tamen, est compositum ex finito et infinito. So it's simplex, it's the most simplex things existing after the first cause, but at the same time, it's the origin of multiplicity. Quod est, and here, this is was one of the most problematic statements, quod est quia omne quod ex eo sequitur causam primam est achilli, id est intelligentia, completa et ultima in potentia et reliquis bonitatibus, but Albert managed to give a very impressively coherent, in my explanation also of this sentence in his own system, obviously. We also read that this being contains...
Vamos a hacer esta pequeña prueba. A ver si esto funciona.
I go on. Okay, then the form it contains intelligible forms, because we read that forma intellectibiles in ipso sunt latiores et vehementius universales. And okay, and that the last statement is just stressing again the idea that there's not a real, that those forms that are in the first created being does not imply a real diversity or a multiplicity in it. So we are now, okay, we can go to the next one. So this is the main text of the fourth proposition of the Liber de Causas. So Albert begins his explanation from the creative act, so from the lemma, prima rerum creatarum est esse. Creation is the very act, obviously, of the first cause, because it does not presuppose anything before it. And in Albert's lexicon, creation and emanation are the same thing, more or less. The product of the primary cause must be, therefore, that which does not presuppose anything before it. The only thing that does not presuppose anything before it, neither according to nature nor according to intellect, and in which the process of resolution, the intellect process of resolution stops, is being. What is last according to the process of resolution is also what is first according to the process of composition. This proves then that being is not only created, but the first created. I will just read some passages. Sic ut enim saepius dictum est, creare ex nihilo producere est. Sorry. Primum autem causat non supposito quod amalio, quo causet. primum ergo causat ex nihilo, causatio ergo ipsius creatio est. Aduc primum est inter causata, quod nihil habet ante se secundum naturam vel intellectum. Esse vero nihil habet ante se secundum intellectum. Si enim fiat resolutio composit in simplex sive causati in causam, secundum ordinem formalium causarum, sive etiam posterioribus in prius, secundum naturam et intellectum, sive tandem particularis in universale, every way we can want to consider this resolution, semper stabit in ente resolutio. I stressed here that he used ente and after few lines esse, because I think that here he's using ens and not esse only because he's also recalling a context that of the fourth proposition was very often used in the context of transcendentals. And the last term of our process is ens, non esse. But the first created is not really ens, but it says, as he will say, he will stress later. So for his argumentation, he needs at the beginning to say that our process, the process of our intellect stops to being, ens. But after a few lines, he said, okay, then esse is the first created things. And he will say in the next page that ens and esse are not really the same. So I've stressed for, could you please, okay, so no, we can go to the next. Thank you. Okay, so what is this esse? Albert gives kind of definition that is at the first sight is not very easy to grasp. In fact, he says that this esse is a simplex conceptus mentis completely undeterminated. In fact, it still seems to refer to the process of the resolution of the it still seems to refer to the process of resolution that we have seen before. In part, it does, in fact. Simplex conceptus mentis may recall the idea how our thought, okay, what it's in our mens. But it is also much more than that. In fact, he says that this being is what is predicated of everything when one asks the question unsit. Now, traditionally, the unsit question refers to the actual existence of a thing, while the question quid sit refers to its quiditative content. Albert, however, immediately, then we will read the text. Albert, however, immediately specifies one, in my opinion, if I'm not mistaken, one fundamental thing. The question unsit can only be answered by the first cause. And in the light of what we said before, what does it mean? Evidently, anyone in a Christian perspective would agree that each thing as somehow its actual existence from God's creative act. Here, however, Albert is, I think, I may be wrong, is saying something more precise according to his doctrine of flow, which has nothing to do with the alternative here between actual existence and essence. The unsit question is answered only by the direct action of the first cause. But we know that the first cause only acts directly one thing, the first created, nothing else. All the rest, and Albert, as I already said, takes the content of the 17th proposition very seriously, is due to a process of determination, so he interprets the per informationem, of the first and only one created thing. I would like to read the passage. Es enim simplex conceptus mentis est, ad nihil formatus vel determinatus, quo quellibet res esse dicitur cum de ipsa queritur per questionem ansit. propter quod in superioribus libri precedenti sostensum est quod quaestio an est non nisi per causam primam determinare potest. Esse enim quod dicto modo simplex conceptus est et informis et in quo sicut in ultimo stat resolutio non nisi cause prime creatum esse potest. Hoc enim non educitur ex aliquo, in quo formalis in coatio sit ipsius, sicut vivere educitur ex est, et sentire ex vivere, et rationale ex sensibili. Quod libet enim sequentium, cum supponat intellectus suo, precedens te non ex nihilo, sed ex aliquo producitur, in quo est in coatio sui esse. Nihil ergo sequentium potes fieri per creationem. Sequens enim se habet ad precedens, ut informans ipsum et determinas. I will say later something about how, what does it mean, because productio enim istorum non per creationem, sed per informationem est, relinquitur igitur quod esse sit primum et creatum, et quod alia causata non creata sint, et quod nullum causatorum prius esse postit quam esse. So I would like to stress that the question unfit, it's obviously something existing, actually existing, but he does not want to say this thing in this passage. We can go to the next one. So it becomes more and more decisive to understand what this being is. Here is another way Albert describes it, again always in the commentary on the fourth proposition. S is a simplex processus a causa prima. So this is the reason why we can answer only through the first cause, the question unfit of this kind of being. S is a simplex processus primus because if sorry, processus enim simplex primus a causa prima procedit ut actus in esse constituens omne quod est. So quia igitur esse processum illum nominat ut actum mentis propter hoc creatum primum potius es esse quam ens velentitas. It's too much. It has a too strong power to say it in a rude way, to be ens. We cannot say properly that ens is the first created things, it's esse. And if we just change esse with forma in this definition, it's not that different from the one we have seen in the first book, processus simplex causa prima or cause prime. We can go to the next one. And he continues always with the description of the first created, and he repeats clearly that this esse is the processus of the first cause, and he adds that this esse does not presuppose anything before itself, even from the point of view of its essential components. It's very important in my opinion. In short, before being created, this esse is a nihil sui, it's nothing. Here we should, I would like to open, but I don't have the time for, a very parenthesis. I will just say it in a very synthetic way. Already Sigeri, in his Questiones in Metaphysicam, thought that Albert was one, that in Albert we could find one of the first authors who maintained a real distinction between being and essence, because of his interpretation of the fourth proposition. And because, according to Sigeri, we could read in exactly the pages we are reading, that everything has essence from itself, while as actual existence from the first cause. But as far as I can understand, there's nothing more far from Albert's intention as this idea. And also because he says somewhere in his decausis, that it's crazy to say that I think at something on its own, that just like my essence on its own and just like to be actualized from the first cause. This is not the point here. Okay. And also it does not have, it is not, does not mean anything to say in this case for this question unsit regarding to the first created, that it only pertain to actual existence, because we are always speaking of the first product of the flow, of the first form, the first, as he repeated this again here. And and Albert said clearly in the first book that flows implies, at least in part, a certain formal identity between the form, between the source of the form and the form that flows. So it does not have this essential content from itself. We can go to the next one. Allora. And then Albert go further, insisting more and more on its universality. And he explains more and more, sorry, I'm repeating myself, what kind of universality it is. It is not universality of a predication, but universality of a principle, and especially of the first principle, which, through his being, somehow enters into the being of each thing. But I would like to read the text together. Ex preinductis accipitur, quod esse unicius sive simplicius est, et per consequens universalius. I'm stressing words that for me are important, and I'll try to explain at the end why. Et per consequens universalius, et latius omnibus entibus sesequentibus. Quam vis enim esse creatum simplex conceptus mentis sit, et in quantum creatum est, secundum sit a primo essentialiter distans abillo, tamen ut dictum est concretum habitudinibus est. Sed iste habitudines non faciunt ipso compositionem essentialem, non enim sunt diversi essentie componentes, sed unius et eiusdem habitudines ad diversa. Quae magis in ratione sunt quam in natura. This is important for my interpretation of the first created things, because he says clearly that primum enim principium, the first cause, inter omnia magis multiplex est in habitudinibus relationum, quae proveniunt et multorum comparationem ad ipsum. So, sort of way we can say the rationes ideales, the creation. But iste habitudines non fundantur in ipso, so in the first cause, sed in the first cause, but they have their foundation in the first created. Sed tamen quia iste habitudines non fundantur in ipso, sed in alis, nullam sue simplicitatis faciunt diminutionem. Sed hoc verum est, quod habitudines esse creati in ipso esse creato fundantur. He's stressing a very important role that first creating being has in creation. Next one. Si ergo est and even though he contains so many endless habitudines, it remains unum, essentialiter unum. And he said, unum autem compositum et potentia et actu virtutem sua unitatis trait abeo, quod est simplex unum, hoc est esse. Hoc enim potestate continet omnia. So another characteristic of this being, it pre-contains everything. And it's really one. We can go to the next slide. Okay. it remains to be understood how Albert understands the context of the secondary proposition of the fourth proposition of the liber de causis, in which we read that the first created is an intelligence. He clarifies that it is not an intellectual substance. It's not the first intelligence. It is instead intelligence in the sense of a form, or how we can read in the Latin translation of Aristotle's De Anima. And he uses often this word in the sense of a concept. The insistence on the term conceptus, that it's not obviously in the text of De Causis, and he always uses conceptus to explain intelligentsia, intelligentsia sive conceptus. My opinion is very significant. My impression is that Albert is gradually guiding the reader, even implicitly, toward this interpretation. I would like to read this passage where we, this is a quotation from which I took the title of my talk. Ex hoc autem, quod esse omnium est vehementius unum, habet, quod latioris et universalitatis omnibus alis. Omne enim compositum per formam componentem sive differentiam contraentem segregatur et restringitur acquibustam. Ens igitur differentia constitutiva determinatum latissimam predicationem abere non potest. Latissima enim predicatio est quest in omnibus. Esse autem primum creatum nulla differentia determinatum est. Ambitus ergo sue predicationis a nullo restrictus est. Sequitur ergo quod latissime universalitatis est, quamvis universalitas sua non sit generis vel differentia vel speciei vel propri vel accidentis, sed principi primi ingredientis in essere rum omnium, quod per analogia refertur adentia. Est igitur esse creatum primum unum, simplex, as we've seen before, the emanation, it's one form, a simple form, a simple fluxus, and he says that is universale latissima universalitatis. In the next slide, we can, and we, okay, here he insists again that this esse intelligentsia or conceptus is a causal principle, that he's predicated of everything as the kind of principle of everything, and specifies two more things, that it has to do with flow, and that it contains, even though it remains one and simple, all the intelligible forms. Quam vis autem esse, quod est creatum primum intelligentiae simplex sit, tamen propter habitudines et potentias quas habet, compositum est ex finito et infinito. Quando autem dicimus esse intelligentiam simplicem, non intelligimus, quod sit intelligentia, quae substantia intellectualis est in decem ordines multiplicata, sic ut in anteriori libro determinatum est, sed quod est intelligentia hoc est forma a lumine intellectus agentis in esse producta et in simplici illo lumine per intentionem accepta. So we find exactly the same definition of the same word in the way he described the first product of the first emanation in the first book, sorry, too many first. And he says, sic enim et Aristoteles loquitur in tertio de anima, ubi dicit intelligentia egitur indivisibilium est, in quibus non est verum. In quibus autem verum et falsum est, iam compositio quaedam intellectum est. Here compositio intellectus is compositio of essences. Talis igitur intelligentia sive conceptus, esse compositum est, sorry, ex finito et infinito, ex duabus, quas habet habitudinibus. Now, and we can go to the next one. No, again this. Could you please tell me the number of the slide? I've lost it. okay, he's always, okay, he states again clearly that this being has to do with flow. Dico autem ultima, quia ultra illa nulla bonitas et nulla potentia adeo ampla est, et lata ad influendum quem ad modum sua. Forma enim intelligibiles, sicut vivere, sentire, raziocinare, in ipso accepte, latiore sunt vehementius quam in se ipsis. In se ipsis tamen etiam intelligentiae quaedam sunt, it contains intelligentiae, forms, sed sunt inferiores intelligentia est, e sub intellectu suo sunt, et in complemento et bonitate e virtute influendi, quia non sunt ita dilatate in se ipsis, sicut sunt, quando virtute accipiuntur in intelligentia quest est. I hope that in the next slide we will discover why he uses the, not yet. Oh, yes. So we can finally come to the term conceptus, trying to understand why Albert uses that to explain, how to guide us to say how we have to understand the intelligentsia. And in his Metaphysics, Albert uses the term conceptus in a technical way when presenting his doctrine of universals. Just for, I would just like to remember that Albert has at least 6 presentations of the doctrine of the transcendentals with slight differences between them. The essential thing, however, I would like to remind here is that, as everybody knows, the standard doctrine universal before him provided for 3 types of universal. I think in the next slide we have the definition through the liberal words. Il y a 3 sortes d'universal. Universel anterem, qui précontiene et possède d'avance la chose ou nature dont il est le principe formal et producteur. L'universel in re est la nature participée en tant qu'elle est distribuée ou distribuable, un acte dans plusieurs. Et l'universel post-rem est ce que l'âme abstrait de la chose. The great novelty of Albert's account is to have split the universal anterem into different universal. But I would like to go back and read together the passage. Here he's in his Metaphysics, and he's explaining how to understand the universal anterem. Hic, okay, et as dixit est universalia forms, et as dixit est universalia anterem existentia, ex quibus omnis res secundum formam accipit principium. Lumen enim agentis intellectus primi, quod extenditur in omne quod est, veit eas in omnem rerum multitudinem. So he's talking about universal.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Manem tigitur in principis se constituentibus, quae sunt processus luminum et lumen intellectus agentis, quod est universaliter agens omnes res. Quia sunt lumen intellectus primi, he again calls forms lumen intellectus primi, ideo sunt lumen et ratio omnis rei, et ex hoc habent quod intelligibiles sunt formae rerum, et quod quid intelligitur per formam suae intelligitur. And then, tales autem forme tripliciter accipi possunt, scilicet ut in principio processionis huius, et sic omnes accipiuntur ut unum, and we have seen that all the forms in the first created are taken as one. Ut in lumine extenso a primo procedentes, et sic differentes sunt ratione, seems to be et tertio, ut in lumine terminato ad res, et sic accipiuntur secundum est esse diverse. Lumen enim causae prime omnem causam secundariam format, ut agat ad formam virtutis agentis primis. So we can go to the next one. So we have seen that he uses concept to identify the universals. And another presentation of his doctrine on the transcendentals, obviously, is found in his De Causis. For the young Deliberà was the most coherent, or the last presentation, the best presentation of Albert's thought. And precisely, anyhow, we find his presentation, the other presentation of his doctrine, in his commentary on the fourth proposition. We are in chapter 20. And I think two things may be stressed before reading the text. And exactly the not easy way in which he distinguishes between the two ways of understanding the Universale and Terem. We have a lumen that brings form into everything that exists. He always speaks about a lumen and a multitude of forms. And this process, in this process, we are always talking about, I think, of the Universale and Terem. This process of the form can be considered as confused or distinct. Plato enim qui consideravit formas it in lumine processu, in quo processu ratione differunt, sicut radi ab uno punto solis procedentes. Formas istas dixit esse differentes, nulli rei materiali comparabiles, eo quod res materialis per esse sum est unum solum, stans in se ipso pigrum et in defectum. Esse autem forme in processu luminis acceptum virtute principium est infinitorum continue mittens formas ad essere erum, et est stans in se ipso fixum et eternum. As igitur Plato dixit esse substantias separatas, differentes genere et specie, secundum quod in processu luminis agentis primi, confuse, vel determinate accipiuntur. So here he's suggesting that the way in which we can distinguish between the Universale and Terem 1 and the Universale and Terem 2 is that in Universale and Terem 1, it's has to be considered as a unity. Everything has to be considered as a unity. And so the four, we don't have any essential composition. And also the process is simple. The form, and at that point, for all the forms are confused. And it's exactly his description of the first created thing. And the second Universale and Terem, where the forms are more and more defined, and they are really different from one another. So my hypothesis at the end is that when Albert says that the first creating being, that this esse is universale latissima universalitatis, he's alluding to the first level of the Universale and Terem, to the first, to the simple form, which is the origin of the fluxus, and which is somehow, as we have seen before, the cause and the principle of everything that flows. And we can go, I think it may be problematic because Albert is not that clear or he changes, seems to change his opinion according to Universale and Terem 1. And but I completely agree with, I would say obviously, with the function deliberato already identified for Universal Theorem 1. La modification qu'Albert impose au dispositif triadique des universaux consiste à insérer un second niveau d'universaux en théorème entre le niveau suprême, celui de l'universel pris dans la cause première, le dieu du livre des causes, et l'universel in ré. Cet universel intermédiaire entre la chose et le principe de leur être est ainsi solidaire de la thèse fondamentale du livre des causes, distinguant la causalité de la première cause, la causalité créatrice par création, mais la causalité des causes intermédiaires, la causalité informatrice per informazione. Ce nouvel universel que l'on peut aussi bien décrire comme intelligible, intelligent, comme formé, formateur, ou comme naturé, naturant, est le vecteur de l'émanation. Donc, je crois que c'est une très heureux, sorry, I think it's a very happy definition of the function of the universal theorem. And when he's talking about, yes, his first created is talking about that. And in the next slide, I've quoted something from your article, just to show that as the authors of studies has shown, for example, in my opinion, Americo understood this characteristic of the first created things better than others. You write, talking about Americo, pour lui, le premier universel intérim n'est pas à proprement parler un universel dans la mesure où ce n'est pas la forme idéale, identique et indissociable de l'essence de Dieu qui cause le particulier, but the most important thing for me is that
so Americus.
Okay. And he says, for example, from the College at Principiorum, ipsum esse simplex recte dicitur lumen intelligentiae universaliter agentis, id est Dei affluens abeodemusque ad ultimam essentiae potentiam. Penetrando quae eius susceptiva seu participativa et profundendo se in intimam uius modi susceptivorum, quae vocantur vultus naturae apud peripateticos capacitatem and so on. He also said, we can read a little here, propter quod uius modi esse dicitur a peripateticis lumen intelligentiae, cuius radi sunt forme universales ante rem, natura, tempore, sicut essentiae formales colorum constituuntur in radis luminis visibilis accommodantes suam universalitatem. So, my just concluding, so to say, remarks, there are more collateral observation, is that in Albert's interpretation, and also in the way it will be later taken up, not only in the 15th century, but also, for example, by Henry of Ghent, as Pasquale Porro had already noted, there is much more proclus than one might have thought at the beginning, not only for having somehow restored the primacy of being with respect to intelligence, but also, for example, with respect to the doctrine of essential cause. Last week we had a paper on essential cause. I was just like to make a really little observation and saying that I also have the text, maybe I'm speaking too much, that some of the statements or some of the caution that the Libera had highlighted in attributing the doctrine of essential causality to Albert can be mitigated, in my opinion, in the light of another interpretation of the way Albert understands being and the first created. And
Thank you so much, Evelyn.
thank you.